Tonight, before you go to bed, look up. Is that just a shadow in the corner? Or is it something that's been waiting, patient and silent, for you to let your guard down? Veronica's story isn't rare. It's a warning. Sleep tight. There was nothing unusual about the town of Elmridge. Tucked behind thickets of pine and folded into the hills like a secret too dull to uncover, it was the kind of place people passed through without a second glance. But within the neat rows of identical homes and freshly cut lawns, something deeply rotten festered behind the walls of number 42 Linden Avenue. For months, the residents believed the tenant, a woman in her late 20s named Veronica Chambers, was just reclusive. They admired her polite hellos, they noticed the blinds were always drawn, and they chalked it up to introversion. But no one could have guessed that Veronica wasn't alone, and hadn't been for some time. It began subtly. A spoon would vanish from the drawer. A pair of socks would be mismatched even though she swore they were sorted the night before. She thought she was losing her mind, that perhaps stress from her new job at the Medical Records Center had begun to erode her memory. And so she adjusted, as people often do. She chalked up every strange occurrence to fatigue or forgetfulness. That is, until the night the water in her shower turned off mid-rinse, and when she stepped out, towel clutched to her chest. The bathroom mirror had been wiped clean. She hadn't touched it. There had been steam, thick and choking, but someone had drawn a smiley face in the mist. From that moment, everything escalated. She would hear footsteps creaking above her when she lay in bed, even though she lived on the top floor. The thud of something heavy landing above her head would wake her up at 3:11 a.m. every single night without fail. She started sleeping with the lights on. She bought a baseball bat. She changed the locks twice. Her friends told her to call the police, but when they arrived and did their sweep, nothing was out of place. They blamed her imagination, and with a smile that didn't reach their eyes, reminded her she wasn't the first woman to live alone and feel unsafe. What no one could explain was why her dog, Murphy, a cheerful golden retriever she had since college, started refusing to go into the guest room. His tail would drop, he'd whine, and sometimes he'd snarl at the closed door as if something were lurking behind it. Veronica began leaving that door shut. Then she nailed it shut. And then, one night, she heard a crash, with splintering, nails screeching as they were wrenched from their sockets. That night, Murphy vanished. The police found no sign of forced entry. They found no paw prints, no trail of blood, no collar, no scratches on the door. The detective assigned to her case didn't hide his suspicion that she had let the dog out and was now playing victim. She knew better. She hadn't imagined the smell that had started oozing out of the vents either. A sickly sweet stench of decay and sweat, like a basement that had been sealed for too long. The truth finally came crashing down one night in April. She had been out late with coworkers, an attempt to convince herself that life was normal, that people were safe, and that paranoia was just a lie her brain liked to whisper. She came home a little past midnight. The lights were still on. She never turned them off anymore, and she kicked off her shoes in the hallway, humming a tune from the bar. But when she stepped into the kitchen, every cabinet was open, every single one, and on the refrigerator, smeared in something that looked dark and congealed, were the words, "You forgot to feed me." She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just stood there, legs trembling, mind blank. And then, from the hallway, she heard the guest room door, still broken, still unhinged, grown open. Veronica was lucky. She was already holding her phone. She hit 911, whispered that someone was in her house, and tried to make her way toward the back door. But just as she reached the handle, the lights shut off. Every single bulb in the house died at once, plunging her into a darkness so complete it felt like drowning. Behind her, she heard a whisper, a voice she didn't recognize. "Don't leave. I like it when you're here." The dispatcher heard the scream, and they heard the scuffle. And the officers that arrived found Veronica outside, barefoot, bleeding from a gash on her thigh, clutching the baseball bat. Inside the house, they found the walls covered in messages. Messages that had been written with fingertips soaked in old blood and dirt. And in the crawl space above the guest room, they found Jeremy Kroll. He was 6'2" and weighed barely 90 pounds. His eyes were wide and glassy, his fingernails yellow and curled, his skin patchy with sores. He hadn't spoken a word when they pulled him out, just shrieked like an animal and clutched a worn-out sock that had once belonged to Murphy. He had been living there for 6 months, surviving on leftovers, scraps, and whatever he could steal from the fridge. And according to his journal, found in a plastic bin in the attic, he believed Veronica was his wife. Jeremy had been released from a state institution the year before, declared mentally unstable but no longer a threat. He'd grown obsessed with Veronica after seeing her once in a grocery store. He had followed her home, memorized her schedule, and when the house was vacant one afternoon, crawled in through the air duct. He stayed there, whispering to her in her sleep, watching her from vents, waiting for the day she would accept him. There was no trial. Jeremy was declared criminally insane and institutionalized again, this time indefinitely. But for Veronica, the damage had already been done. She never returned to the house. She moved across the country, changed her name, and for years afterward, refused to lock her bedroom door, afraid not of intruders, but of what she might find on the other side if the door were ever shut. Moving on to the next story on our list. Across the state, in a town known for its salt mines and quiet lakes, 82-year-old Harold Kingsley was beloved by his neighbors. A widower and former watchmaker, he was known for walking his golden cane and sharing peppermint candies with local children. So when he was found dead in his kitchen, crumpled beside the oven with his hands clasped like he had been praying, the entire neighborhood was plunged into mourning. But it wasn't the death that made headlines, it was what the police found afterward. At first, the coroner believed it was natural causes. No wounds, no bruises, no sign of foul play. But then a forensic analyst noticed something odd on the footage from a security camera across the street. In the middle of the night, 2 days before Harold's death, the lights in his attic turned on, and then off, and then on again. When investigators climbed into the attic, they found a makeshift living space. Crates filled with canned food, a stack of books, mostly romance novels, and dozens of photographs, pictures of Harold taken from above, from air vents, from inside the house. They traced the origin of the camera angles and realized with mounting horror that tiny holes had been drilled through the ceiling into nearly every room. They didn't have to search far to find the culprit. That very evening, a neighbor 2 doors down reported something, or someone, moving in their attic. When officers broke open the hatch, they found a tunnel dug between the houses, barely wide enough for a grown man to crawl through. And inside, curled into himself like a corpse awaiting burial, was Lester Mays. Lester had worked for the town's housing department for over 20 years. Quiet, unassuming, never married. No one had suspected him. But for the last 10 years, he had been moving through the attics of Elmridge, living inside the walls of abandoned houses, and in Harold's case, not so abandoned ones. He claimed he loved Harold like a father, that he watched over him, protected him, and cried when he realized Harold's health was failing. But when pressed, he couldn't explain why he had drilled holes into the house, why he had collected nail clippings and hair strands and kept them in jars labeled with dates, or why, in the corner of the attic, they found a mannequin dressed in Harold's clothes, wearing his glasses, seated in a rocking chair facing the entrance. The mannequin had been kissed. The case was sealed. Lester was tried and sentenced. But for months afterward, homes in the area were emptied. Families refused to sleep with attic doors closed. And during one particularly cruel winter night, local radio stations reported a man spotted on rooftops, crawling from one chimney to another, whispering names into the snow. Moving on to our next story. In the summer of 1997, Talia Freeman, a college freshman, took up a part-time job as a house sitter in a gated community outside Boston. She loved it: free Wi-Fi, a pool, and time to catch up on reading. The couple she was house-sitting for were art collectors and had warned her not to enter the basement where their temperature-controlled storage was located. She had no intention of breaking the rule, but on her third night, she heard music coming from beneath the floorboards. Classical, faint but unmistakable. When she pressed her ear to the tile above the basement door, she heard a violin weeping. Curiosity got the better of her. She unlocked the basement and walked down the winding staircase, flashlight in hand. The light flickered, the air grew colder, and in the center of the room, surrounded by statues and shrouded furniture, was a man playing the violin. Blindfolded, shirtless, and sobbing, Talia screamed. The man dropped the violin and vanished behind a curtain. She ran up the stairs and called the homeowners. They dismissed her, said she must have imagined it, that the motion sensors didn't detect anyone else on the property. But when they returned from their trip, police were called anyway. The man was gone, but behind one of the large oil paintings in the hallway, they found a hole, tunnel, a passageway filled with blankets, rotten fruit, and hundreds of sketches, each one depicting Talia sleeping, eating, walking. He had drawn her every move. For months, he had been living inside the walls of the house, emerging only when it was safe, and then slipping back into the silence. The violin, it turned out, had belonged to the previous owner's daughter, who had disappeared 3 years earlier. The girl was never found. And so, beneath the safe and ordinary exteriors of the suburbs, behind drywall and beneath floorboards, the unwanted guests have waited. Some watched, some touched, some whispered lullabies in voices never meant to be heard. Because the real terror isn't in ghosts or monsters that vanish with the light, but in the men who wait in silence, in the creaking of stairs at midnight, and the subtle realization that you are not, and never were, alone. Now ask yourself, have you ever misplaced something small and blamed your own forgetfulness? Have you heard footsteps in the ceiling or found a door slightly ajar when you swore you shut it? How certain are you that no one has ever been inside your attic without your permission? Drop your thoughts and your fears in the comments. And if these stories made you rethink your home, subscribe now. Because next time, it might not be a stranger in the dark. It might be someone who's already inside,